In the remote hills of western Pennsylvania, where the Allegheny Mountains cast long shadows over forgotten valleys, lies a cemetery holding one of America's most unsettling mysteries. The Brennan family plot contains 7 graves, 2 parents and 5 children. But the true horror is that all 5 children died on their 16th birthday. Between 1847 and 1863, each child reached that milestone only to vanish without a trace, their bodies later discovered under circumstances so disturbing that the reports were buried for over a century. The precision of these deaths defied all logic, leaving the town grasping for explanations. The truth, locked away in sealed county records until 1987, begins with the Brennans' arrival in Ligonier. In 1831, Cornelius Brennan, a skilled blacksmith from County Cork, settled in Westmoreland County with his wife, Bridge O'Sullivan Brennan. Cornelius quickly earned a reputation as the finest metalworker for miles. While Bridge, known for her striking beauty and unsettling intelligence, possessed a deep knowledge of herbs, remedies, and weather patterns that made her both sought after and feared. Their Gothic revival home stood apart from the town, much like the family itself, prosperous, yet isolated amid growing tensions between Protestant settlers and Irish Catholic newcomers. The Brennan children, Patrick, Mary, Thomas, Catherine, and Michael, were remarkably bright, inheriting their father's precision and their mother's old-world knowledge. Cornelius taught the boys the blacksmith trade, while Bridge passed down remedies, folklore, and skills whispered to have roots older than Christianity. Despite their success, the family's difference set them apart, and by the 1840s, they lived in a world of quiet privilege shadowed by unspoken unease. That shadow fell fully on March 15, 1847, Patrick's 16th birthday. The day began like any other, with Patrick at the forge alongside his father, unaware that before the sun set, his life and the fate of every Brennan child after him would be sealed in one of Pennsylvania's darkest legends. Patrick had been in high spirits that day, talking about taking on more responsibility in the family business and even dreaming of opening a second forge in Greensburg. 9-year-old Thomas watched his older brother with admiration, organizing tools nearby. As the golden afternoon light bathed the stone house, Patrick was at the anvil speaking with his father about whether the evening celebration should include music and dancing. Moments later, he was gone. His leather apron lay warm in the dirt, and the birthday hammer Cornelius had made for him, engraved with intricate Celtic knotwork, rested glowing on the anvil where Patrick had been just seconds earlier. The forge fire roared as if nothing had changed, yet Patrick had vanished, as if swallowed by the earth. Thomas's screams brought Cornelius running, and within minutes, neighbors rushed to help. Mrs. Elenina Fitzgerald, hanging laundry with a clear view of the forge, all afternoon swore she had seen no one arrive or leave no movement at all, until the cries rang out. Sheriff Edmund Cartwright, a disciplined veteran of the Mexican-American War, led search parties through every valley mine shaft and creek bed within 20 miles, working through the night by torchlight. For 3 days, Protestants and Catholics, Irish and Germans, labored side by side while women prepared food and children carried messages. On the 3rd day, in a place already searched, twice a treeless, perfectly circular clearing beside Loyal Hannah Creek, 2 miles away, Cartwright's team found Patrick. He lay at the exact center, arms folded, as if carefully prepared for burial. His clothing spotless and untouched by the elements, his expression serene, with the faint trace of a smile. But his eyes were wide open, irises and pupils gone, leaving only milky white orbs that gleamed unnaturally in the light. Dr. Harrison Wells, the town's only physician, examined him in bafflement. There were no injuries, no signs of illness, no calluses on his hands, as though he had never worked the forge. His heart had simply stopped. More chilling still, every blade of grass in a perfect 15-foot ring around him was dead crisped, as if struck by sudden frost, the pattern so exact it seemed measured. Sheriff Cartwright ordered the body taken to the church, but the unease that settled over Ligonier would never truly lift. What happened next shook the town's faith to its core. Father McDermott, the Irish priest who had baptized Patrick and watched him grow, found himself physically unable to enter the room where the boy's body lay. Each time he approached, an overpowering dread gripped him. His chest tightening, his breath turning to ice, his hands trembling as if he were walking to his own grave. After 3 failed attempts to perform the rites, the funeral fell to Reverend Samuel Fletcher, the Protestant minister who later admitted that in 3 decades of ministry, he had never encountered such a suffocating, oppressive atmosphere. The entire town followed Patrick's coffin in a solemn procession from the church to the hilltop cemetery. But what lingered most in their memories was not the service, it was Bridge Brennan's unsettling composure. Instead of breaking down in grief, she stood silent, her green eyes fixed far beyond the mourners. When neighbors offered condolences, she whispered in her thick Irish accent, "He was the first. More must follow before the debt is paid." The words chilled all who heard them, though none could guess what debt she meant, or why she seemed so certain more tragedy was coming. In the months that followed, changes in Bridge only deepened the unease. A streak of pure white appeared in her dark hair, running from temple to nape. She claimed no memory of how it came to be. Her once vivid green eyes dulled to a grayish hue that made holding her gaze uncomfortable. She was often seen in the clearing where Patrick's body had been found, sitting silently or speaking in Gaelic to the still dead circle of grass. Children swore they saw her there during thunderstorms, standing at its center, arms raised to the sky, chanting as rain drenched her. When questioned, she would only say she was keeping the connection strong and making sure the others understand what's expected. Whispers turned to fear when exactly 3 years later, on March 15th, 1850, 18-year-old Mary Brennan vanished in the same inexplicable manner. That morning, she had been working on household accounts, her mathematical skill impressing even the town's bank manager. Mary was widely admired. Beautiful, intelligent, courted by prominent young men. But at precisely 3:17 p.m., the same time Patrick had disappeared, she stepped outside to hang laundry. Thomas, now 11, watched her pause mid-task, tilt her head, as if hearing a distant voice, then walked deliberately toward the woods without a word. The search unfolded just as it had before organized, determined but this time weighed down by the dread of a prophecy unfolding. They searched with a grim inevitability, knowing they would find Mary exactly where Patrick had been, at the center of the barren circle beside loyal Hannah Creek. The moment her body was discovered, folded neatly across the chest, with those same sightless white eyes, any last shred of hope dissolved. The circle of dead grass was sharper now, its edges perfectly measured, as though each death had etched the boundary more deeply into the earth. Wells repeated his meticulous examination and once again found no cause of death. But this time he noticed something far worse. Mary's eyes, when lifted open, reflected his image endlessly, as though he were staring down an infinite tunnel of mirrors into a depth that defied the physical world. The sight unsteadied him so badly, he had to step away to regain control. The funeral drew even more attention than Patrick's. Visitors from surrounding towns and reporters from Pittsburgh arrived eager to witness what papers would call the Ligonier mystery, though city readers dismissed it as rural superstition. Father McDermott again found himself unable to officiate, struck by such intense cold and panic that Dr. Wells had to treat him. He claimed he could hear whispered languages he didn't recognize whenever he tried to speak the funeral prayers. Reverend Fletcher reluctantly stepped in, but even he faltered beneath the suffocating atmosphere. Some mourners reported dizziness and nausea. Others swore they glimpsed shadowy figures weaving through the crowd, gone the instant they turned to look. It was during Mary's funeral that the first changes in the land became undeniable. Birds stopped singing in the cemetery trees. Horses balked at passing the Brennan stone house. Dogs howled when the wind blew from the creek. By 1851, Ligonier's optimism had curdled into unease. Property values near the Brennan home plummeted and families quietly moved away. Those who stayed lived under the shadow of one date, March 15, 1853, the day Thomas Brennan would turn 16. The question was no longer if he would die, but how such precision could be repeated and what force could enforce such a pattern. Thomas knew. He had seen it happen twice. Sharp-minded and unwilling to simply wait for death, he tried every desperate measure to escape it. He slept in different places each night, the church pews under Father McDermott's reluctant watch, the sheriff's cot in his office, even a cell in the county jail. He sought answers from Dr. Wells, probing for medical explanations. He turned to both priest and minister for spiritual protection they could not promise. He begged his parents to send him away to relatives in Philadelphia, to a wagon train heading west, even to the army under a false age. But Cornelius and Bridge refused with a quiet finality. "Running won't change anything," Bridge told him by the fire, her gray eyes reflecting the flames like something not entirely human. "The debt follows the bloodline, not the place. Better to face it here where we understand it than die alone among strangers." Sheriff Cartwright, worn down and haunted by his failures, finally agreed to place Thomas in protective custody as his birthday approached, though both men knew the bars and locks might mean nothing against whatever was coming. Sheriff Cartwright's plan to guard Thomas was driven by both genuine concern and a desperate need to finally solve the mystery that had destroyed his reputation. Thomas was locked in the county's most secure cell, a stone-walled chamber with a single narrow window and a door that required 2 separate keys. Deputies stood watch in rotating shifts, ensuring he was never alone, while the sheriff's own wife prepared his meals to rule out poisoning. The cell was inspected daily for anything that could be used for self-harm. Yet none of it mattered. On the morning of March 15, 1853, the deputies found the cell locked from the outside, the keys still with Cartwright and Thomas gone. The window was too small to escape through the walls, unmarked, the floor undisturbed. His neatly folded clothes lay on the cot, and carved deep into the stone wall, apparently with his fingernails, were the words, "The debt must be paid in full. The old blood remembers what the new blood has forgotten." The scratches were too precise, too deep for human nails. No one bothered with a full search this time. They went straight to the clearing by Loyal Hannah Creek and found him exactly where they expected, in the center of the dead circle now nearly 20 feet across. His body bore the same white eyes, serene expression, and complete absence of any medical cause of death. But Thomas had left something the others hadn't, a scrap of parchment in his right hand, marked with strange symbols that looked part Ogham script, part something far older. When Dr. Wells tried to remove it, the parchment disintegrated into dust, leaving faint burned-in impressions on Thomas's palm. Father McDermott forced himself to look later, writing in his private journal that the symbols were older than Christ, older than Rome, tokens of debts no church or state could overrule. He burned the journal 3 days later, but not before sealing a single copy inside a metal box hidden in the church's cornerstone, where it would remain until discovered during renovations in 1967. Thomas's funeral broke whatever fragile thread of normalcy the town had clung to. Neither Catholic nor Protestant clergy could bring themselves to officiate. Even prayers seemed to falter in the presence of the Brennans. Cornelius spoke instead, his voice carrying a strange echo as if coming from deep underground. Bridge stood beside him, her hair streak of white now widened her eyes completely, gray, gazing past the living, as if watching something no one else could see. From that day forward, whispers no longer speculated about poison or madness. They spoke of ancient debts, curses older than Pennsylvania itself. Reverend William Malloud, the town's Presbyterian minister, began researching the valley's history, corresponding with scholars at Yale and Harvard, and interviewing elderly Seneca in New York. What he found in crumbling archives and oral histories would offer the first framework for understanding the Brennan deaths, though the truth was far worse than any local rumor. By early 1856, with Catherine Brennan's 16th birthday approaching, Ligonier had been transformed into a place hollowed by fear. Property values collapsed. Whole streets stood empty, windows, boarded yards wild. Businesses failed as customers fled. Families left in the dead of night without farewells, the Irish first accusing Bridge of bringing ruin to them all, followed by the Germans muttering about old-world curses reborn. Those who remained did so either from poverty or grim determination to see the pattern play out. Sheriff Cartwright, his hair gone entirely gray, hands trembling, was a shadow of the man who once commanded respect. Dr. Wells kept meticulous notes on every odd occurrence, animals acting strangely, sudden illnesses, and an alarming number of people dreaming of white-eyed children calling to them from the banks of loyal Hannah Creek. Dr. Wells's medical practice had all but collapsed by 1856, as people no longer trusted science to explain what plagued their town. Every cough, fever, and shadow in the night was now blamed on the curse. In stark contrast to Thomas's frantic fight against fate, Catherine met her looming 16th birthday with an unsettling calm, composed, deliberate, as if she were already halfway to the place her siblings had gone. For 3 years she had prepared for this day, and in her final months she pressed her mother for answers. It was during these quiet, fire-lit evenings that Bridge finally revealed the truth she had hidden for 25 years. The Brennans, she explained, were more than Irish immigrants. They were the last living branch of an ancient Druidic bloodline, bearers of a debt born centuries before in Ireland and carried across the ocean. Cornelius had never known his wife's true heritage, but the land had known. Loyal Hannah Creek, Bridge said, was not a coincidence. It was a summons. The earth itself remembered the injustice that had been committed here, and the Brennan bloodline carried the energy required to settle it. The deaths of Patrick, Mary, and Thomas had not been random tragedy. They were payments installments in a spiritual transaction designed to restore balance after violence had torn the natural order apart nearly a century ago. The debt was not made by us. Bridge told her daughter, her gray eyes catching the firelight like polished stone. But it can only be paid by us. Each child who dies brings us closer to release. When the last payment is made, the debt will be finished, and those who remain will be free. As Catherine's birthday approached, Ligonier became a theater of strange phenomena. Residents heard children's voices singing Irish laments in the woods, by the creek, though no children lived nearby. Animals refused to cross invisible boundaries, forcing long detours around familiar streets. The weather swung violently between spring and winter, killing early flowers, freezing the ground, and leaving ice patterns shaped like Celtic knots. The wind carried scents of burning peat and something older, still the smell of ancient earth and old bones. On the morning of March 15th, 1856, Catherine, dressed in a white gown, Bridge had sewn over months. Its patterns a fusion of Celtic symbols and something far older. Instead of hiding, she spent her last hours visiting every remaining family in Ligonier, thanking them for their kindness, apologizing for the chaos the Brennans had brought, and leaving them small gifts. Her final visit was to Dr. Wells, to whom she entrusted the task of recording every detail of her family's deaths. Someone must bear witness, she told him, her voice carrying the strange echo that now haunted her father's speech. Someone must remember that we lived, that we loved, that we were more than this pattern. At precisely 3:17 p.m., the moment her siblings had vanished, Catherine walked from Ligonier toward loyal Hannah Creek. The remaining townsfolk followed in silence, forming a somber procession nearly a quarter-mile long. In the clearing, the dead circle had grown to nearly 25 feet, its edges drawn, with impossible precision. Around it grew plant species long extinct in Pennsylvania. Catherine entered the clearing with the grace of a bride walking down an aisle, her white gown fanning out around her as she knelt at its center. The crowd held its breath, knowing they were watching history repeat for the fourth time and perhaps draw closer to whatever terrible balance the Brennans had been summoned to fulfill. Catherine knelt at the center of the clearing, folding her hands in her lap, and began speaking in what seemed like Irish Gaelic, but older residents swore her words carried sounds from languages far more ancient. For 17 minutes, she remained there chanting in a steady rhythm that mingled with the wind in the trees, her voice drifting over the valley in a strange harmony that made the onlookers hold their breath. Some prayed silently. Others simply watched, knowing they were witnessing something that would forever alter their understanding of the world. Then at precisely 3:34 p.m., the valley itself seemed to mourn. A low, haunting cry rose from the ground, a sound unlike any human or animal, yet steeped in grief so deep it felt centuries old. As the wail faded, Catherine's eyes turned white, her expression softened into serene peace, and her heart stopped. Unlike her siblings, Catherine died before witnesses, and what followed was even more disturbing. Her lips continued moving for nearly an hour after her death. Though no sound escaped, several in the crowd claimed to understand her silent words as if they were being spoken directly into their minds. Dr. Wells seated close enough to see her mouth form syllables in English, Irish, and Gaelic, and something utterly alien reported that her message included apologies to the town, explanations about debts older than memory, and most chillingly specific details of how and when her younger brother Michael would die 7 years later. The clearing itself reacted instantly. The dead grass circle widened to 30 feet, the air inside dropping 20 degrees frost, etching elaborate Celtic knotwork into the ground. Strange shadows moved within the boundary, some shaped like dancing children who vanished whenever someone looked directly at them, leaving only shifting patterns of light that strained the eye. Catherine's death marked a shift. The earlier tragedies had been followed by uneasy calm, but her passing seemed to open a door, allowing something from beyond to press deeper into Ligonier. In the weeks that followed, animals acted unnaturally. Cats ignored mice, dogs howled through the day, horses refused to travel on curved paths that might take them near the clearing. Weather turned chaotic. Rain fell in sharp-edged shapes. Snow materialized during warm afternoons and melted upward, and strange scents, burning peat and the smell of ancient bones, drifted on the wind. At night, the clearing came alive with the sound of unseen children laughing and music that resembled Irish dance tunes played on instruments no living person had ever heard. 3 days after Catherine's funeral, Cornelius Brennan shattered. Neighbors found him in his forge, having destroyed every piece of work he'd ever made, his hands torn and bleeding from pounding the anvil where his children once learned the trade. His voice, now thick with the otherworldly echo first heard at Thomas's funeral, fractured into overlapping tones that seemed to speak from multiple worlds at once. Bridge changed even more dramatically. Her once dark hair turned completely silver, her eyes pale as clouded glass. She abandoned English entirely, speaking only in rapid Gaelic, so archaic that even other Irish families struggled to understand her. She spent her days seated at Catherine's grave, conversing with the headstone, as if hearing answers, discussing finances, household tasks, and preparations for what she called the final payment. Those who overheard her swore she spoke as though the end of the Brennan line and the closing of the debt was already scheduled. By the time Catherine's grave conversations had turned fully to Michael's fate, it was clear to anyone left in Ligonier that the Brennans were no longer part of the ordinary world. Bridge seemed to be receiving instructions from voices only she could hear, guidance on how to prepare for her youngest child's 16th birthday. The final act in a supernatural bargain that had methodically claimed 4 of her children. The family's isolation deepened. Cornelius abandoned the forge entirely, letting the fires that had burned for 2 decades die cold, leaving the stone building as a silent monument to a life already gone. Michael, just 12, carried the weight of his fate in his body and voice. In 4 short years, he had aged decades, his dark hair streaked with gray, deep lines etched at the corners of his eyes. His voice took on the same haunting echo as his parents', but in him it rang with a strange, almost melodic harmony. He often went days without sleep, terrified of the visions that came when he closed his eyes. Patrick, Mary Thomas, and Catherine calling from the clearing, showing him the realm they now inhabited, telling him his role in ending the debt. When exhaustion overtook him, neighbors heard him speaking to unseen companions in the night discussions about timing terms and the precise form of the final payment. It was during this period that Reverend Mloud's years of research finally bore fruit. Delving into the valley's pre-colonial history with the help of scholars from Yale and Harvard, and interviewing elderly Seneca elders in New York, he uncovered the origin of the curse. In 1754, Scots-Irish settlers had camped beside Loyal Hannah Creek, unknowingly trespassing on sacred Seneca ground, used for spiritual ceremonies for generations. A Seneca war party attacked, killing 17 settlers, but 5 warriors, including a young shaman named Gwasuta, were captured alive. Believing this would end further attacks, the settlers executed all 5 captives in the clearing. In his final moments, Gwasuta pronounced a curse 5 lives would be taken in retribution, but only when the right bloodline settled on the land under the right spiritual conditions. This was no simple act of vengeance. It was meant to restore balance, heal the wound carved into the valley's spirit, and allow the 5 unjustly slain to find peace. The last chapter of the Brennan tragedy began 3 days before Michael's 16th birthday. In a break from the established pattern, he disappeared early, vanishing from the stone house without a sound. The town no longer organized search parties. Those few who remained believed the boy was already beyond saving. Only Cornelius and Bridge searched, moving through the hills like specters, their voices carrying the otherworldly resonance that had grown sharper since Catherine's death. On the morning of March 15th, 1863, what would have been his birthday, Michael was found in the clearing. The dead circle had spread to fill nearly the entire space. He stood in its center, arms raised toward the sky, lips moving in an ancient chant that blended seamlessly with the deep, resonant hum rising from the earth. His eyes were the same unearthly white as his siblings, yet he was still breathing, suspended in a state between life and death. Bridge approached, speaking to him in the old Gaelic of his childhood. Slowly his gaze fixed on her, and in a voice that seemed to carry the very echo of the valley, harmonizing with subterranean tones, he spoke. "The debt is paid, Mother. The old ways return. The land will remember what it was before the strangers came. The 5 are now complete, and the circle closes as it was meant to close." At exactly 3:17 p.m., the hour that had claimed each of his siblings, Michael's heart stopped. The Brennan debt was settled, and with it, whatever force had ruled over Loyal Hannah Creek for more than a century finally released its hold. Unlike Patrick, Mary Thomas, and Catherine, whose bodies had fallen at the moment of death, Michael remained upright in the center of the clearing, arms still raised toward the March sun that had borne witness to 4 deaths before his own. What followed was unlike anything seen in Ligonier's long nightmare. The circle of dead grass erupted in a burst of life, not with the familiar plants of Pennsylvania, but with species sacred to the Seneca people. Wild rice ghost pipe, bloodroot, and others unseen in the valley for over a century. They grew with impossible speed, maturing within hours, into patterns that from the surrounding hills formed symbols tied to an older, deeper understanding of the bond between people and the land. Cornelius and Bridge stood with their son until sunset, watching the landscape reshape itself into something older than European memory. As night fell, witnesses saw cold blue-white lights gliding between the trees, their glow like foxfire or spirits moving just beyond reach. By dawn, Cornelius and Bridge lay dead at Michael's feet, as though they had knelt in devotion and chosen to follow him into whatever lay beyond. Dr. Wells, conducting the final examination of his career, found no cause of death. Their hearts had simply stopped, as if they had willingly surrendered their lives to complete the ancient bargain. When the funeral procession arrived, Michael's body still stood in the supernatural garden. But Cornelius and Bridge were gone, vanished, leaving only their clothes and the lingering scent of burning peat, sharp and earthy like the bogs of Ireland. Michael was eventually buried beside his siblings, yet his grave refused permanence. Every headstone split cleanly down the center within days of being placed until cemetery officials abandoned the effort. The plot remains unmarked, though the grass above grows in a perfect spiral that never fades, regardless of weather or season. By 1865, Ligonier was a hollow shell. 3/4 of its people had fled, unwilling to live where the boundary between the natural and supernatural had been so violently torn open. Those who stayed endured a valley still alive with strange energies. The clearing became a pilgrimage site for spiritualists and researchers, until it was cordoned off. Too many visitors left blinded, hearing voices in unknown tongues, or in 3 documented cases, developing the same white-eyed condition that had marked the Brennan children. Years later, papers found in Reverend Loud's estate offered the clearest explanation. The curse of Guasuta had been fulfilled, but not as mere vengeance. Through correspondence with Seneca elders and study of pre-Christian Celtic lore, Loud concluded that the Brennan deaths had served as a healing act, restoring balance to sacred ground, scarred by violence and ignorance. The garden of ancient plants, the peaceful nature of the deaths, and the voluntary passing of Cornelius and Bridge all pointed to a resolution far more complex and merciful than the original curse implied. The records were sealed in 1867 and released only in 1987, by which time the clearing had been absorbed into a state nature preserve. The strange events had faded into folklore, yet the questions remained. How could 5 healthy children die at the same age, at the same hour, in the same place, with no physical cause? What force could orchestrate such precise justice? And how many other families might carry debts they never knew existed? The Brennan tragedy endures as a reminder that some obligations outlive the people who make them, that the land remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, and that sometimes the price of healing is paid in lives that seem undeserving of the burden. It forces us to ask, was this fate inevitable, or could it have been avoided? And if such debts still exist, who will be the next to pay them? Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.